All right, let's get into some deep learning with CNNs. So this week we're going to look at some larger convolutional neural networks and then something called transfer learning because the training of these larger networks is going to get more and more complicated. There's been a lot of work on these, but so basically convolutional neural networks are about 10 years old. The first one, AlexNet, was published in 2012, and since then there's been a continuous update on different versions and different structures, different architectures for this. The first kind of set that were out there was AlexNet, which was one of the first ones in 2012, VGGNet, which is a set of different networks, came out in 2014. Google released their Inception 1 in 2014 and Inception 2 in 2015. So some of those are some of the basics of these neural networks. These neural networks generally competed with what is called the ImageNet Large Visual Recognition Challenge. ImageNet is a large database. Here's the Wikipedia article. More than 14 million labeled images in it. Lots of categories like balloons and strawberries. There'll be hundreds of images of each of those. More than 20,000 categories are in ImageNet. And since starting in 2010, they were running this annual competition. I think they did that through about 2017, 2018, something like that. And so you can look at these different models and how accurate they were with this. And AlexNet was a big hop. I think the previous ones were in like the 50s, and so it was a big increase in accuracy for this. These networks can get more complicated. So one thing we often measure is how many parameters, that's how many weights can be changed or trained in these networks. Some of these are getting up there to 60 million and 100 and more than 100 million weights, and so these are getting really large networks here. So talk about some of the issues with that. Here's just an overview of what AlexNet looks like and VGG. So here's a zoomed in version of AlexNet. So AlexNet is what I would call like a traditional neural network in some ways. We have a convolutional layer, another convolutional layer. We start with 96 filters and then 256 filters. We then do max pooling and a convolutional layer and then pool again. Now one thing that was a little different with AlexNet is it used different sizes. So originally the first layer was 11 by 11 filters and then 5 by 5 filters, and then it settled down into standard 3 by 3 models. And there's 3 pooling layers, and so convolution layer, pooling, and 2 convolutional layers and pooling. Then the number of filters were about 256 or 384 in that range. Then after the final pooling layer, we had a fully connected layer with 4,000 nodes in it, and another one with 4,000 nodes and 1,000, and then finally our softmax at the end. So this fully connected layers had a lot of weights in them for that. VGG 16 and VGG 19 were two versions, the two more popular versions of the VGG network, and they kind of made a more standardized approach than this, and this is what we see again very commonly today. So again, their first layers were 3 by 3 convolutional layers with 64 filters, and then they pooled the image, so they made the image smaller, and then more 3 by 3 convolutional layers, but now with 128 filters, and another pool, and then 3 by 3 filters with 256, and then a pool, and then 3 by 3 filters with 512 here. So VGG19 just added a couple layers to this. This often kept going with another pool, some more 3 by 3 filters again, but staying at 512 filters here, and then our final pool, and then again repeating this sort of stuff with 3 fully connected layers. The first two with 4,000 nodes, and then the last one with 1,000 nodes, and then finally our softmax, which selects the highest node for the winning, for that category here. So this is kind of more of a standard approach, and kind of the models we've been kind of looking at here. Now Google introduces a different model here called the Inception Network. So while these are just traditional, which I would call sequential layers, where just one layer fed to another layer, fed to another layer, and it all was stacked sequential layers here. Google used a more complicated layer structure where each layer was actually initially four different filters kind of run in parallel. A 1x1 convolutional layer, a 3x3, a 5x5, and a 3x3 max pooling layer, all combined, or I mean all running kind of in parallel. So they all get the input from the previous layer, and then they all send their output to the next layer, which we call a concatenation layer, which puts all these different outputs together for that. So this doesn't follow the normal sequential model. And again, they modified this for version 2 and made it even more complicated where they had even layers here. So this was what is called an inception model. A 1x1 convolutional layer on this side. Here they had a 1x1 convolutional layer feeding a 3x3 convolutional layer, and here a 1x1 convolutional feeding a 5x5 convolutional, and then a 3x3 max pooling going to a 1x1 convolutional layer feeding there. So these modules will be connected up together. I don't think I just Googled, here's the image of this if you just want to see. So this is a typical view of this where we're getting our input. And again, they did a couple standard convolutional layers here. And then they started these layers of inception layers. So you can see this kind of inception layer where the input is sent in parallel to all these layers fed forward, and then it's brought together again in what's called brought together in this concatenation layer, and then again another layer just like this repeated, and another layer just like that repeated generally, and then that kept going. They did also another strange thing where they pulled their outputs and did softmaxes along the way and trained it at 3 different spots. So they duplicated the output and had it train in at 3 different spots on here. But mainly it was this convolutional layer. And again, there were some small tweaks to it, but basically that was the unit they had. Okay, so and in one way you can see that to build that, it's not sequential. So in our Python code, in our Keras model, we don't use a sequential network. We have to use this more complicated way where we specify a layer here, and then we have to say what it's getting its input from, and every layer is given a name here, and then we might specify a new layer here. And then again, in that layer, we specify where it's getting its input from here. And then we put all in, and so some of these layers will get their inputs from other parts of these layers. So we define all of our different modules here, and they're all connected in the right way. And then at the end, we concatenate the outputs of a bunch of these layers here into one layer, and then we send that on to the next layer often. So again, you don't have to learn how to do that. I just thought I'd just show you that the way we have to set this up is a little different, and we have to move away from our sequential ones. So this is kind of beyond the scope of our class. We won't be setting up networks like this in the class. We'll be sticking with more traditional ones here. So I want to point you to this article up here, a review of these. So if you want to read more about these, this is a pretty good article talking about AlexNet, VGG16, and GoogleNet, and kind of goes over the architecture, how they're structured, the training results that it achieved here. And then again, the VGG16 from 2014 and that architecture. This is just a different picture of it here. And then there's actually different configurations of VGG. There is VGG16, VGG19, so this is the number of weighted layers here. There was also a VGG13 and a couple VGG11s here. And so again, this talks a little bit about the accuracy of this, and then goes into this GoogleNet, this inception layers, how those were created here. And then this is the whole architecture for that. And again, talks about some of the layouts and outputs of this layer and some of the results this had. So if you want to read a little bit more about this article right here, right under the table, gives a good overview of those 3 networks. So that brings us up to about 2015, and 2015 saw a fair number of changes. So besides Inception layer there, we also had residue networks were introduced. So again, this followed the stacked approach, kind of like VGD16, where you have these layers that are stacked. This sort of approach here of layers. But what it did is introduced a special shortcut. So some layers would actually get inputs not just from the layer below it, but also from a layer like 2 or 3 below it. And these were called residue layers. So they would get special weights or connections, not just to the layer below it, but also jump 2 or 3 layers down here. So this is what this is trying to show in here, is that this layer, the input from this layer feeds down to this layer feeds down to this layer goes out to the output. But there is a special connection down here that kind of skipped over 2 layers, and so this layer down here would receive input not just from the previous layer, but layer 3 back for this, or 4 back, depending on how the structures. Then they introduced a couple more common structures in here with using these 1 by 1 layers. And there was some work discovered. First, people thought 1 by 1 filter layers would not do anything, and it was discovered around 2014 and 15 that 1 by 1 filters actually are really good at combining features at multiple layers in the same location. And were actually quite useful. So and did not cost very much. And so there were a lot of use of these 1 by 1 features surrounding a 3 by 3 feature here, and then again what's called a residue sometimes connection around this. So Residue Networks came out here, and then we built some larger networks here, and basically we're trying to balance 3 things. So the number of layers here that we had, and then the number of filters at each layer. So how many filters here? So if you remember back to VGG here, we have more layers, and then at each layer we might have 128 filters, or 256, or 512 filters. So the question is, how many filters and how many layers? Is it good to have multiple layers between each pooling and things like that? So there's a lot of work done around trying to figure out the number of layers and then the number of filters with each layer. Besides that, we also looked at the resolution of the images. So these original images were generally resized to about 256 pixels by 256 pixels, which is not a very accurate image. Your phone is a couple thousand by a couple thousand pixels often. So we do have images that are much more detailed, and so a lot of these networks started to work with these more higher resolution images, and then to compress these down, they generally then had to have more layers. So if you have more resolution, you can have more layers. One of the things, especially when you do some max pooling, if you start with a small image, like a 32 by 32 pixel image, you cut it in half, that's 16 by 16, cut it in half, 8 by 8, cut it in half, that's 4 by 4, cut it in half, that's 2 by 2. Basically, before too many of the max pooling layers, you're out of pixels on your image there. But if you start with an image that's like 512 by 512, or 1000 by 1000, 1024 by 1024, something like that, then you can do more max pooling here. So again, there was these questions on what resolution should you resize your images to, and then the number of filters at each layer, and then how many layers you should do. So here's a good article that kind of looks at this. Is from an AI summer course here, and goes over this and lays out some stuff. So this just shows, again, this idea of if you have a normal network, do you want to make it wider where you have more filters, or deeper where you have more layers, or higher resolution images here. And then this shows a picture of different image networks and how they are structured. So here's a blow off of that. So like the size of the circle is how many connections, up to like over 100 million are the larger circles, down to like 5 or 10 million are the smaller circles. And the higher up here is the more accuracy. So the top ones here are more accuracy. And then another measure is how long it takes to train, or how much what kind of computer power we have. The computers have been getting faster and faster, especially with special hardware for training these networks here. So we're able to train these networks a little faster because we had more operations here. So this just shows like the VGG networks were very big, but they were pretty accurate for their time. There and some of the other ones like this Google LeNet is the Inception Networks. That's another name for the Google network is the LeNet. So again, that didn't have many. That was very small here, for this to work, and it came relatively early. And then we have different versions of ResNet here. You'll see different versions of ResNet. Some more complicated Inception networks that are doing quite well up here. And stuff. So we'll look at some of these other networks here through this article. This article gives a view of like, here's without convolutional neural networks we're running, and then here's the AlexNet, the first one, and then we're moving up. This is VGG Inception version 3. We haven't shown you actually that, but that's not that much different than version 2 in some ways. And then some of the newer versions are getting really high. So you might ask, what are some of these? What is NASNet doing and stuff like that? So again, here's that model here. And again, talking about optimizing this, some code here. So again, they talk about VGG here. They talk about Inception or Google LeNet here. And some motivation for that, and the Google Inception filters here, and talks a little bit about that. So this isn't a bad thing to read about this. Now it talks about Inception v2 and v3 here, and some of the structures of that and how that changed. And then this ResNet, which we mentioned, where we have this connection that skips a couple layers and different ways of doing that for this. And so here's a bigger model of that, and you can see every 2 nodes there's a connection that skips over every 2 nodes and runs that here. So DenseNet was another network that came out around 2017 for that, and the way that was set up. So it had lots of convolutional layers, or what are called dense blocks here, and then transition layers between them for this. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this for this. Now, BitTransfer is a new network. So this network, the BitTransfer network, was based on ResNet. ResNet has different numbers, also like 152 different versions, not versions of it, but kind of scale sizes on numbers on it. And it actually uses 4 ResNet 152s kind of running in parallel for it. So we have 4 more channels here, and it was trained on a huge data set, the JFT data set, which is over 300 million labeled images for it. It did some stuff with normalization. We'll talk about normalization towards the end of today, and worked with something called weight standardization. I won't even introduce that in this course, but just changed a little bit of how it normalizes data between layers here. But that was the main choice, is how it kind of normalized data between the layers here. And this shows you, so again, I mentioned ResNet. They have these different kind of size or scale things. ResNet 50, 101, and 152 are some different ResNets. And then how they perform on these different image challenges for them. Efficientnet is a new, again, came out in about 2019. And again, tried to define a network structure that was relatively small but very accurate here. So the number of parameters is on this size and the accuracy is on this size. So where like ResNet had 60 million parameters, Efficientnet was more efficient here and only had like 10 billion parameters, but was still better, and even better than like Exception or Inception v2 here. Oh no, this is Inception v2. This is a combination of the Inception v2 and ResNet here. But again, very accurate. And again, what we're seeing with Efficientnet also is it's often small enough and fast enough so that you can train it and actually then use it on like a cell phone or a resource constrained device like a mobile phone to do some sort of recognition. So rather than sending things off to the cloud, sometimes Efficientnet can run right on the phone and do that. So when you take a picture of your flower and it or your and it then tells you what type of flower that is or butterfly or any of those sorts of apps that are out there for this. So Efficientnet does really good performance again with less connections. It also introduces some different architectures on how it comes. This is coming from a network called MobileNet, which isn't in this diagram, which introduced, again, combining like one by one residue layers connections that would skip other connections, along with some slightly altered convolutional layers that would be some expanding and contracting convolutional layers, which are really beyond the kind of the scope of this class here. But one thing to note is that like now what you're doing is often just manually trying out some different layer structures, and people at Google were trying the same thing, and then they thought, well, we better just try out some different options here. So they did what is called a grid search, and a grid search just means, okay, we don't know how many layers to do, so we're going to try anything from 10 to 100 layers, and then we don't know how many filters to do at each layer, and so they're going to try all sorts of different kinds. So just going to make a grid to see if they cover all the possible combinations of architectures here. And they did this and they ran it on a lot of networks here, and they based this on what is called the MobileNet and ResNet architectures here, and we come up with a general architecture. But again, so Google was just trying, using a computer to try out all sorts of different combinations, and that is how they kind of generated this Efficientnet architecture. So, okay. The rest of this paper that I was going over talks about, again, this balance between more layers, more filters, and higher resolution images. I'm not going to go into detail because, again, Google has largely did a lot of this by just trying out lots of things, and this is more of a mathematical approach to that. So, okay. So that's kind of where we are now. We're at some very complicated networks out there that like Efficientnet, NobleNet, Inception v3, and things like that that are running, and some of the newer network structures for that. But all these networks are very large and still take lots of time to train. So it's beyond the scope of most problems, most companies, to train one of these large networks. So what do? We're using what is called now more transfer learning with pre-trained networks that way. So what we will do is a company like Google or Microsoft or someone like that will train one of these networks with a whole bunch of images, on a huge computer system, very fast processors, and take a week to train one of these models with this. And on a huge data set, because again, we often need a huge data set to train all these images. And then the data set will learn to extract a set of features from these images. And then we can use that pre-trained model as a basis for a new model that will recognize the same set of features, but now we can apply it to a new model. So maybe, again, you can kind of imagine, well, let's look at some things before I go on. So this is what TensorFlow's tutorial. This is a nice tutorial on this pre-trained learning, transfer learning we call it, and fine-tuning here, and goes over a lot of the code on how this is done. And we'll actually do some of this is actually taken from the lab. Well, you see some of this in our lab. Our learning exercise in the next part. But here's the general idea here is that so we're going to use transfer learning. So we're going to take a pre-trained model and transfer it to a new attempt. And so we're going to assume the old model, the pre-trained model, has learned these feature maps And so we don't have to start from scratch to train it how to do things. So here's like an example here. This is VGG16 here. So again, let's say we're doing that. And we train that to recognize, and we train on a huge data set with lots of images because this has lots of parameters, lots of connections in here. And so we trained it on a pretty common and pretty not a very specific, general purpose like image data set. And this would maybe then learn, the lower levels would learn hopefully some simple things like edge detection and line detections. And maybe this is learning some shapes or some colors or some different patterns. And they're building up these features at each level. They're learning like 512 different features of different kinds at these levels. Here from these demo images. And then up here, then we use these fully connected layers that will take those features and then try to figure out what category this. So, if you're thinking of trying to identify a car, you're looking for a couple wheels and fenders and windshield and that sort of stuff. So it will learn to recognize those features here. So with transfer learning, we take this VGG, pre-trained VGG model here, and we chop off, sometimes we say we take the head off of it, or the top of the filter of the network. And so the softmax layer we get rid of, and generally any fully connected layers, and it can vary. You can actually specify, you can actually get rid of some of these layers too and recreate them if you want, but often it's the fully connected layers and the softmax layers on top. And then you create some new fully connected layers. They usually may not have to be as big because maybe your recognition problem is maybe not recognizing 10,000 different types of categories of images, but just 1,000 different butterflies or something like that. Or the 20 different packages on your conveyor belt line. So you just have a couple fully connected layers and then a new softmax layer. So these are new layers, and these are pre-trained layers that you have here. Now you have two options for this. One is fine tuning. So you set it up, you have these pre-trained layers and pre-trained weights, and then that feeds into these new layers here. And then you start training, and you train everything. You certainly train these connections, but you also can fine tune and train these connections. Now, these connections hopefully have been learned pretty well and shouldn't need too much changing, but maybe there are some features in your image set that weren't in this original data set, and so by fine-tuning you might be tweaking these filters and the connections here that you're learning for that. So fine-tuning is one way to do it. It does require slower training, and you're training a lot more weights. Another common way is just to fix these weights, to just lock this pre-trained model in here and then just do training on the new area. So you just train here, here, here. So that gives you a whole very large network, but very, very fast training because you're only training these networks here. And that's what we'll tend to do. We'll tend to lock in these ones and only train our network up here. So then again, that's a relatively small network that we're training from this stuff. So this coming week, we'll look at a couple exercises where you both define your own network and try to train it from scratch, and then use a pre-trained network here and try to do transfer learning, and maybe just either do fine-tuning on it where you're training the whole thing and and part of that is just adjusting these weights slightly because hopefully they're in good shape, or else fixing these weights and just training the new layers for that. Okay. Just a couple quick notes. When you're going through in some of these readings and stuff, you may notice some new layers. So I just want to point out some layers that are also out there now. We've been using max pooling 2D, which again, in these networks, we'll combine it, we'll do a convolution layer and then we'll do a pool layer, and that's usually a max pooling layer here. And again, remember, that's taking a 2x2 grid or filter and applying it in each 2x2 spot. It's finding the max, the highest value there. Average pooling is similar to that, but it finds the average rather than the max of each area. So some of these modules will use average pooling there. There's also something called global average pooling in these networks, one thing that's often not shown is that when we go from this last two-dimensional layer into a fully connected layer, we have to do what is called to flatten this out. And there has to be a flattened layer here. And that takes basically this two-dimensional layer and lays it all out in one dimension for this. But that often makes these layers with lots of connections. So another way of doing this is global average pooling applies an average pooling filter that's the size of the entire image, basically, and so basically just averages the entire image out. Here's a nice description of what that kind of does from another book I've used before in our graduate course for this. So the average pooling layer output means that each feature map drops any spatial information, which is fine because now we're not really interested in doing much for spatial recognition for this. So that's one thing we'll sometimes see rather than a flattened layer, a global average pooling layer. There's also a spatial dropout layer. We've mentioned dropout layers before, which are good to use, especially with fully connected layers. You can actually use them down here, but they're not optimized for that. If you're using dropout layers to kind of watch for so to combat overfitting, you can, instead of a dropout layer in these convolutional areas with 2D areas, you can use these spatial dropout 2D layers. Some of these networks, and there's been some work that I'm not going too much into, normalizing the data between layers. So we often scale the data before we send it into the network, but then as it goes through layers, it tends to get unscaled again. So you can actually put in batch normalization layers in here, which will again rescale the data between layers. Some people do that between every layer. Other people do it every 3 or 5 layers or something like that, and that's improves some performance. And I just meant to mention concatenate because again, some of these more complicated networks will use a concatenated layer to combine a number of layers before it into one layer. So again, I just want to mention these. You don't have to use these or whatever, but again, they come up in some of the articles, so I just wanted to give this as a reference. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this introduction to more complicated convolutional neural network structures.